Okay, so welcome again. Once again, my name is Michele Lancione and I'm professor of geography here in Turin. And with Abdul Malik as co-director of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, it's my great pleasure to have with us today, if only virtually, Dr. Tanzil Shafique. Tanzil is currently a lecturer, assistant professor at the Sheffield School of Architecture. He co-leads a Master in Urban Design program and the Southern Theorizing Group. As an activist, Tanzil convenes the Dhaka-based platform for housing justice, which works on diverse housing rights issues. Tanzil holds a PhD from the Melbourne School of Design, where he taught graduate planning and design studios. He's also an honorary member at the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the University of Melbourne. Tanzil also co-founded and now co-directs Studio Abierto Open Studio, a think plus do tank on architecture and urbanism. Previously, Tanzil was a researcher fellow and studio instructor at the Fay Jones School of Architecture plus Design, as well as project designer at the Community Design Center, both at the University of Arkansas. His work has garnered numerous AIA national awards for urban and regional planning, as well as his writing on design philosophy and urbanism has been published internationally. He holds a Master in Ecological Urbanism from Purcell Polytechnic Institute in New York. And this is quite an impressive CV already, but I'm really looking forward to today's talk from Tanzil, who is going to be around the myth of the bottom-up in precarious housing, lessons from the largest informal settlement in Dhaka. So, Tanzil, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, I don't relate with the introduction at all. I mean, it feels like someone else's life. So, but thank you. That was very kind of you, and it's great to be here. I'll just share my screen and see if that's working. Yeah.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
And is it moving?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you again, Tanzil.
Okay. So where should I start? I mean, the best place is to start from my own home, where I grew up, which you can see in the picture on the left, not in the shanty part of the picture, but the rather formal looking, the high-rise buildings up there. So I live somewhere there. And then I used to, I did my undergrad, and then I used to go through this settlement every day during my undergrad. So this is where all of this research is actually born. So what I'm going to present today is part of my doctoral dissertation, but also I got published last year in a housing studies journal. So one aspect of it. So I'm going to just sort of weave through that. And honestly, I'm using this opportunity to rethink or think through some of the things that I wrote and that I think about it, because I think some of it is changing. So if you hear me today and you go and read the journal, it might not match. So be warned. And the particular titling, the myth of the bottom up, I'll just go into that in a minute. But overall, what I want to do today is talk about the bottom up as the point of departure and question that, and then just go a bit into Dhaka's context, think of the settlement that I investigated as a liminality, and this is something I picked up from a paper by Michele and Malik. And then look into the mechanisms of production, the tendencies of entanglements of power, and then try to reinterpret that through an understanding of desire. This notion of desire is drawn primarily from Deleuze and Guattari, but also from other Southern contexts and understandings. I'm not going into the references yet, but hopefully it makes sense. So this notion of the bottom up, this is curious for me because, growing up, I mean, I have seen a lot of literature in international development, and even now, this idea of the bottom up seems to be like this magnificent catchphrase. The moment you attach it to anything, then suddenly it's about the community. Suddenly it's about, it's sort of like a validation for a lot of things that can get done. The reason for my critical stance on it is because I've seen firsthand what happens when these are used by multilateral agencies for large-scale projects that end up, in settlements, that end up in to facilitate different forms of inhabitation, but also different forms of displacement, of injustices, through the very means of using that word. So, which is why I'm sort of interested to unpack it. But that unpacking is not just a theoretical unpacking. I mean, I will present a very simple case. I'll look at a settlement and see what's so bottom up about it. There are other words: unplanned, spontaneous, organic, unself-conscious. So even informal, you can put it in the same bag. I mean, I'm not so beholden to the word informal settlement anymore. But all of this has a sensibility of the bottom up, and which I appreciate. There's this notion of things being locally led, things being led by the community, and that I appreciate. But maybe it's time that we think of things, at a much more nuanced way. So one of the key points of departure is, so Mark Purcell, in 2013, he writes this, a very polemical piece, and he sort of like criticizes the use of the right to the city and how it has been, sort of interpreted. So he goes to criticize those who are using quite at random the notion of right to the city. He brings in Deleuze, and he talks about how one of the places for him where he sees a radical alternative that's happening is informal settlements, and he relates this notion of intermezzo. And then if you read his text, and how he frames it, he doesn't mention the word bottom up, but there is this idea of, and I picked up certain words, right? Outside the normal institution of the state and the market, new ways, people, I don't know which people, but people are inventing to survive beyond the state, beyond the market. And then this notion of self, and you'll see the self-organization, self-management. And I can understand from far, I mean, if you were to look at it, it's easy to say that people are building it. But then, one might question that, which city isn't built by people in that sense? And then this other notion of self-organization, one wonders what this self is, what this self constitutes. And then there's the notion of the outside, and it's beyond just a geographic or territorial margin. What is this outside? I mean, who is constituted in that inside and outside? That liminality is so thick that I don't understand actually when people use these words to describe realities that I have seen through my empirical study, which is why I think there might be other ways to think about it. I didn't notice this paper before, but I was just reading it recently, and then this is by Michele and Malik, who's here. And then this particular framing caught my eye, because this notion of multiple ontologies of the everyday counter-political, it relates to the plurality of existence, of inhabitation, of existing, of arranging, but also of unsettling, of rearranging from many different stakeholders, that is weaved, interweaved, and intertwined in a way it's almost, it's shape-shifting in a way. So if a large scale theorization looks at it and then frames it in one way, it might be that within 5 years that theory on the ground has melted. So there is this particular mutability that I observed, which I think it's important to bring into the way we try to understand precarious housing, informalities, however you want to frame it. So the points of departure is pretty much everyone uses these terms like multiplicity of processes, heterogeneity of constituents, plurality of relationalities. We know these are sort of has become intellectual starting points. I mean, the moment you can drop them, you'll know that you sort of like get an affinity to the discourse. So I'm interested to sort of generate a new vernacular so that these aren't so abstract, so that this can be sort of pinned down and given some particular new wordings. So the point is to generate a sort of a new vernacular, and underneath, I'm interested, and this interest comes in part for my training in, my first training being in architecture, which has something to do with imaginaries, which is why I'm interested to sort of move from the discourse of power to desire. So as you'll see, I'll try to sort of reflect through the lens of desire at the very end after I presented the findings. So just a note on methods. So I'm very influenced by two of my favorite books on method, which is not, which is sort of like against it, and one is after it. So in a way, so Paul Feyerabend's Against Method and After Method, John Law. The way I see the methodology that you'll see, of course, it employs lots of different methods taken from social science, but there is a lack of definition to it, in the sense that there are always overlappings. They're always overlapping. So, for example, I'm doing an ethnographic, or inquiry, or I'm doing an in-depth interview that slowly turns into like a workshop, and then other people joined in the settlement, and then that became like a pedagogical session for me and for them. So, of course, there's all this mix of traditional ethnographic inquiries, but also something that I'm bringing from my background as an architect is mapping, so morphological mapping that you see on the right, running workshops, working with the settlers, but then also, as you can see towards the right, bottom right, I was also teaching when I was doing my fieldwork in 2019, and we were also working with the dwellers to imagine their future city. So those were, those were like exhibitions. So all of this sort of mutated as part, and then has become part of what we now call Platform for Just Housing. So we are Dhaka-based, like-minded civil society, academics, and slum and dwellers coming together to work on several aspects of housing rights and justice issues, which included, for example, we're working currently on court cases. So we're working with lawyers who are representing the dwellers in the settlement in the court against eviction. So some of the mapping, some of the maps, and all of these things have been sort of given to the lawyers to use as evidence of people living and people having a very complex life there. So this is all sort of like part of the methods in a way that's informing each other. So back to Dhaka, and just to give a sense of where we are, not going to go into the detail. The settlement that we'll be looking at is called Karail. And before zooming into the settlement, I just wanted to give a few facts about Dhaka. Dhaka is sort of like, I was just doing this study. Dhaka is the most under-researched city amongst the mega cities, the so-called mega cities. So, a population of 23 million officially, but I'm sure it's more than that. And so it's going to be the fourth largest city by 2030. In any case, So this is a map of Dhaka at a geographic scale of 30 kilometer by 30 kilometer. And this shows sort of the underlying geographic capacities of the city in a sense. So anywhere you see a darker color is basically prone to flooding. And then the yellow and the light yellow is sort of like the upper ground. And you see that it's a very complex deltaic region. But interestingly, you'll see that the settlement that I'll be presenting is the red dot, which is actually situated in one of the most, the best place to build a city in this landscape is the higher ground. And Karail, unlike a lot of other quote unquote informal settlements and slums, which are at the periphery of the city, Karail is located dead center in one of the best, sort of like ecologically best places to build. And we'll come to that. So these are sort of like some of the questions that I'm signposting that we'll answer later, like how come it's where it is. Looking at the growth of Dhaka, so it's pretty much, its growth from the 16th century onwards. You can see starting from the river all the way north. Now, curiously, Dhaka's planning and its colonial history as part of the British Empire, you start to see this logic of enclavation, which is a planning through enclaves. So all the red blocks that you see here, these are all planned enclaves in the city. So these are planned areas, and the rest of the city sort of like has been left on its own. So a lot of these villages have become urbanized. A lot of them have have developed at a local scale, smaller scale municipalities. So it's a mix of all of those things. Within that, and then this is an image of a mapping of slum locations. Now, I put this in quote marks. This is done through GIS, and this is sort of like only looks at the informal street patterns, and then it starts to assign the logic of slum. So you can see on the lower side, this huge chunk that is categorized as a slum is actually one of the oldest areas in the city, which is not illegal, which is quite formal in a sense, but it's only that the street morphology is irregular. So of course you see what a problem that is when we take morphology as the key marker of informality, and it's not the case there. Anyway, the point being that there are different sort of informalities in the city and different forms of inhabitation. So you can see that there are, informally planned cities or informally planned parts. There are some, in B, you can see a refugee camp from 1971, urbanized village, squatted settlement. So D is basically what we're going to look at. And then, of course, I know Paroj is here. And of course, there are a lot of pavement dwellers who are not even registered at this apparatus. So they sort of, they're beyond the capture of Google Earth or GIS apparatus. So beyond that. But just to give you a sense of what, the scale of habitation. So there are more than 5,000 of these slums. And then there's a rough estimate. I mean, the census is very difficult because a lot of these are floating populations. They come to the city for 6 months, 3 months, 8 months, 9 months, and then they go back to their hometown. Some of them stay longer. So it's quite difficult. How do you capture them in a census data? So, but roughly there's an estimate of 4.5 million dwellers. And just to give an idea, that's the population of New Zealand. So that's just in Dhaka. So we're zooming in and then we're looking at the settlement. As I said, this is sort of hemmed in from all sides by the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. So this is sort of like you have the Fifth Avenue on one side, and you have Greenwich Village, and then you have the settlement right in the middle. And then if we are zooming in, I am particularly interested in sort of like the area that's marked, which is the western edge. Because for my PhD, I was looking at how this place has transformed in the last 20 years. And I was tracing the socio-material history of it in the last 20 years. So on the left, you see the city as it exists. And on the right, you can see the city as it's planned. So there are currently two projects that are planned in this set on top of this land. The land is government owned. So they have a lake beautification project. And then they want to build a software and an IT industrial park, which would mean a dislocation of more than 300,000 people who are living there. And this is right now, there are court injunctions, which is why it's stopped right now. But I mean, the eviction can happen any day. There have been multiple attempts already. So in terms of the psychological state, everyone here, there is the sort of like operate between a desire to stay and to inhabit, but also a fear of uprooting. And of course, it's sort of like an unjust condition by itself, but just, that. So in terms of eviction, there are multiple attempts, and I'll come to the politics of it. And then, of course, with regards to the eviction, there have been particular protests on, that's ongoing. There are civil society movements around it. But curiously, if I could just translate what's written on the banner, now that the funny thing is, it's not that they are against the eviction per se. All they're saying, these people who are protesting, is saying, you have to give us compensation if you evict us. Now, the funny thing is, some of these protesters are actually people who have the most land occupied in Karail. So we'll come to that when we talk about tenure, that they have a lot to lose in the sense that, but they also know that if they get compensation, they will be they will be quite wealthy in that regard. So there is all this politics and this local striations. So there is no singular community per se that comes together and then that does this protest because they're going to be evicted. There are all these local manifestations of power and differences of desire, which we'll talk about. But just as a way of tracing the material transformation, which is sort of like at the heart of my research, was looking at this western edge and how this transformed in 20 years. So you saw in 2001, and this is roughly about 500 meters by 500 meters. So you can imagine the density at which this is happening. So 20, and I think this is up till 2018. Yeah, so if you go now, that that lake has disappeared. There is like literally 2-meter distance now between the houses. Now I'm interested to understand, can I just simply say that people did it? Slum dwellers built this in 20 years. I mean, is it so simple? Now that's where sort of like where the investigation lies. So how did I start trying to understand and unpack this? So it started with tracing sort of like the material, but then slowly it ventured into the social and the political aspects of it. So tracing the socio-material arrangements. Now, a very simple way of understanding that growth was trying to map how much was growing each year. And then suddenly you start to see that the growth was not, it's not absolutely equal. There are certain dissipations, so there is a rhythm to it. And then in 2014, you can see that there is this absolutely huge jump in the formation of the settlement. And then, it starts to, make you question why would you have that at a certain year. This is a map showing the 20 years of transformation. So the yellow is the oldest and the red is the latest. And if you can see the northern edge versus the southern edge, and you start to see the difference, not just, at a first glance, it may look like quite similar, but the northern part is much more regularized. The northern part, there is a much faster construction compared to the southern. And then you start to see that if it was all the same, why are these things different? Why are not people in the southern part not just reclaiming the lake? So again, these are some of the questions that started from that morphological inquiry. Now you might be wondering, what is this unit of urban production here? So the unit of the arrangement is basically a studio apartment. So if you were to just go in and then you start to see a single room dwelling unit. So the single room dwelling unit will have a family of 4 or 5, and then they begin to get clustered and share some resources. So the kitchen and the toilets and storage, those things will start to get shared. A lot of the everyday inhabitation and the everyday politics is around very simple things. So you might notice like this huge water storage tanks, and then you certainly see it on the plan. In some houses, there are more water storage tanks than there is actually furniture, is because the politics of the water is that you get water for 5 minutes every day, and then you have to capture as much water as you can within that 5 minutes. So you fill up as many tanks as you can. So, and that sort of impacts the way that everyday, interior spaces are even organized. So I sort of studied that, and then I looked in 4 particular neighborhoods, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these 4 particular neighborhoods, and looked at the differentiation. And and I was I was trying to understand, why wouldn't they just follow one? Why aren't they random? And of course, there's some differentiation coming from wealth, some differentiation coming from materials. But what is sort of like the socio-political organization of this difference? So this was mapping all the units, and interestingly, you start to notice that there are single households with a single room, but households with 80 or 90 or even 200. So you can see this household, this cluster has around 80 rooms. So they're organized at very, very different scales, but all within very close proximity. Then this was a mapping of the services, which was, interestingly, I found that, of course, the services was really distributed well. There is no injustice in terms of how the services are distributed, very even distribution. I was looking at how the materiality changed over time. Not just going to go into the detail of this, but just shows the constant sort of upgrading that's already happening in the settlements, and this rearrangements of material already in place all the time. In terms of access, you start to see how, in terms of how it's related to the city. So this is, the red is sort of like the formal city streets. And you see that there is only one access point from the formal city street into the settlement. And this is a construction, this is a social construction of that, unjust access. And in terms of, fire safety, and in terms of any of these things, there is really no other way than, there was a fire in 2016. Everyone literally had to run out of the settlement from that one road. So of course, again, this talks about how there are material arrangements and material detachments. So I know Malik is writing about this at the moment, but it's not just about the relationalities, but these constructed detachments that really impact the everyday life. so the mapping sort of started to lead to, for me to identify these differences and see that what we see as a material construction is never just purely material. So I'll give this example. So this is a map of all the laneways and all the streets. So for me, when I went there the first day, it was not very accessible because I could only go to the orange streets, let's say. But as I started to know people more, a lot of the doors and a lot of the corridors operate on a social basis. So there is a socio-spatial determination of accessibility in the sense that there's you could actually use someone else's corridor to get to the next house and to the next house. So all of that, again, shows the entanglement of the socio-political construction of of streets, of everyday urban elements that often we don't appreciate the political construction of it. In terms of the land, and this is sort of like the last tracing, and I'll go into the political aspect of it. If once I started to map the land, you start to see that the deposition, the sedimentation of the land is first of all, it's created in a way that avoids the gaze of the formal city. So anywhere there is a contact point with the formal city, the edge of that, you can see that there are only very minimal reclamation. But the lake that is sort of like towards the interior of the settlement, where it lacks a sense of visibility, that's where you have the highest level of reclamation. And the reclamation that happened here, so this was me sort of following how this is done. And this is where the outside and the inside started falling apart. So this reclamation is actually using the construction debris from the formal city. So this was me following, as you can see here, following a rickshaw van, carrying construction debris from the formal city, giving out to contractors who are supposed to take it to a landfill, but they don't go there to the landfill. They come to the settlement, they sell it to the local middlemen, and then these middlemen, they come and they use that debris to sort of reclaim the land. So, neoliberal development in the formal city, high-rises being built, and which leads to sort of like a production of construction debris, that becomes the new ground, a new land in a literal sense of this settlement. So you start to see these entanglements, when you trace the material. Now, just in terms of the pluralities or the complexities of the everyday use, one of the things that I mapped was also how people are using it. So in a way, how different functions are mixed in the settlement. And you can see in the map throughout time, what started out as purely a residential use, over time, there is a diversification of functions. A lot of industry started growing up. There's so the densification is not just a change in the building or the construction, the increased rate of construction, but also an increased rate of differentiation that started happening in the settlement. So this was just a house that was constructed, that was converted from a residence, so differentiation without change in form or the change in construction. But there were certain constructions which were really paradigmatic within the settlement. So, for example, if you start to see the mosques, for example, which were very formal construction, almost to the level of design by an engineer, designed by an architect. So you can see that mosque there. These are communally built. People who themselves are categorized as poor often donate 1/3 of their income into the mosque. And also, one of the other key political infrastructure in the settlement was the bazaar. now the traditional, let's say, wet market. So I was there, and then in front of my own eyes, I saw the transformation of a vendor sitting on the outside, and you can see the rearrangements, the same vendors. You can see the top left, the vendor sitting outside, how they sort of like bought the houses at the back, started constructing this bazaar, invited all the street vendors to come inside and pay them the rent rather than paying the police every day for sitting on the street. So this happened within a space of 2 months, literally sort of like a folding. And now instead of paying the police, the local street vendors, they're paying, the arrangement of people and local leaders who made that, who produced that market. So I think, not going to go into the detail, but this was just to show how it's entangled with the mobility of the formal city. So the rickshaws, funny, the funny thing is in Dhaka, you see rickshaws everywhere, but the formal planning never really assumed any space for them. So this settlement is not just a habitation of the human slum dweller, quote unquote, but also a habitation of these rickshaws. So vast amounts of rickshaw garages generated also the settlement. And then the last bit, so this is sort of like just to show the complexity of urban life within the settlement. In terms of public space, which feels like the most constricted thing inside, and then you start to see a plurality of public space production within the settlement, which you can see that they're at a domestic level, they're at a neighborly level, and they're at a communal level. So all of these things that are produced, let's say these socio-material arrangements that are produced, and what are these mechanisms of production? So I propose that there are 3 distinct levels of organization here, which is individualized, collectivized, and syndicated. And I'll sort of like try to situate them, like if this is, I'll try to situate this abstraction. So what I mean by individualized organization is, if you look at the very first layers of the settlement, you will see that the material organization or the housing organization was much less coordinated. There was almost like an ad hoc basis. And the story goes like this. The first settlers, they were not rural to urban migrants, as often is believed. They were actually coming from the formal neighborhoods of the city. The rent was too much. They couldn't afford the rent. So they saw an opportunity. They started building. And for them, this was always a temporary. Now, people who are living there, it's been 40 years now, they have built their house. For them, it was always temporary. So this sense of temporariness led to a lack of a collective life. There was lack of coming together or deciding things together. It was all on ad hoc basis at the very beginning. So there is this individualized ad hoc organization that happened at one level. Then there is a more collectivized organization. And this collectivized organization is much more egalitarian. It is much more based on the sense that Mark Purcell talks about as a collective formation. So for example, you can see the material traces of it. So the place that you see here, and you can see there is a regularity of the settlement here, because this part of the settlement was actually, was claimed by a group of settlers who were renting in another part. They got together. There was planning meetings. There was a sort of like a 3 months planning before. In one night, they sort of took hold of that causeway, and then they assigned themselves basically like 10 feet each, and which has given that morphological regularity. But this also reflects sort of like the socio-political arrangement at that time. Now, regularity is not a good marker because the third level of organization that you see in the settlement, which is the northern side, you'll see that it's also quite regimental and it's quite regular. But this regularity is produced by local land mafias who actually had less control on the southern side, but on the northern side, what they did was what is basically they reclaimed the land, they sold apartments. So they sold an apartment, they got the money, put it back in. This was speculative development. This was neoliberal development there, right there. And they build those apartments. It's very shabby construction. And then they sold it. So that's why in the northern side, you have dwellers who don't know each other. There are no kinship ties, there are no, because they all bought those properties and they moved in the north, as opposed to the southern side in the settlement. And there is, kinship ties or affinities through work. And these differences are key in how a collective life has ensued in the settlements now. So if I had mapped the time and do sort of like a projection, you'll see that this settlement progressively had a strong collective life from 2006 to 2013, around that time. And since 2014, the syndicated way of development, the sort of like the neoliberal way of development, has taken over the settlement and then sort of wiped out that collective life. So in the last 6-7 years, it has really dissipated that collective life. Now, this is the last part of the presentation. Why is that? And now, interestingly, 2014 is when there was the national elections. And that starts to make you wonder how all of these things are interconnected. Now, if I look at sort of the tendencies, which is how I am thinking of these relationalities and detachments, is these entanglements. So if you look at the settlement and then you start to see very curious material manifestations of ownership. People will put their names on it and they'll say that they own it. They sort of like hold it. So there are people who are landlords and who are tenants. And this ratio is roughly 20-80. And this really is a radically different politics between the people who sort of like hold on to the land and who are the residential tenants. And again, this is a mapping of the tenureship, and you start to see that there's differences of holding. So you have landholders who hold 200 rooms and landholders who hold 1 room. So this sort of disproportionate difference and inequality within the settlement is radically impacts how it has grown. So again, I talked about this idea of how things are shifting, and you can see I just traced one particular guy who started with 1 room. He went on to own a large chunk, but then he was killed, and then how the land he was holding started to diminish. So you can see how this is an ever-shifting, the tenure that I mapped, I'm sure by 2023, in these 4 years, it has changed as well. And then how are these places governed? And you can see that even though in the settlement, you will never see sort of like a physical manifestation of it, but there are very clear demarcations of local leaders having a particular, area under control. And this is what actually led to the differentiation that I showed you between the northern side and the southern side. And if you were to map all of these entanglements and then say, how are these related? And if you thought that this was a standalone settlement, you would map, the tenants, the landholders, the different committees, different committees to run the bazaar, the mosque, and then you'll start to see that how they're connected. But in reality, there is no outside and inside, because in reality, local political parties, the police, the mayor's office, all of this large scale formal actors are implicated in the production of the settlement, in the everyday running of the settlement, including international donor agencies, including researchers like us, Karail has produced 35 PhDs, 35 or 45 PhD, around that number have gone. So we're all implicated in that everyday production. But if you were to sort of summarize this, then you could summarize this as three particular tendencies, which is there is a strong tendency coming from the developmental regime. So large-scale NGOs, multilaterals who fund local NGOs. So there is this politics of NGOs. And then there are sort of a tendency towards electoral. So this comes through the political party wings, the national parties, how they're represented, how they recruit local leaders, how they run, and how they reward local leaders after an election to build with impunity. So there are two, but there is also a grassroots governance. There is a local everyday governance, uninhabited beyond this electoral and developmental governance from the outside. There is a local quote unquote slum politics that Martin Costa talks about, that sort of works to run this settlement. So in summary, you can start to see this relationalities as ranging from things that enable the everyday life in the settlement and that enable a collective life there, to entanglements which sort of entrap and which oppose it. So if you were to bring all of that into a reductive views, then you could start to see that there are these everyday alignments with the settlement outside. So the formal city and this one, it's entangled in a positive way. It generates work, but also there are everyday oppositions, trying to build a boundary wall to stop them. So these are let's say at a molecular scale. But then things happen at a larger scale. The state comes in, evictions happen, arson. Arson is a good way of evicting people, actually. And then also, but there are state mechanisms. So for example, the courts have been quite helpful in arranging emancipatory arrangements in that settlement. So you start to see, this is not just easy to, say all of this into the word bottom up. And this is my last slide, in the sense that I haven't really talked about it, but I'll just end with one story. So if you can see the fire there that happened in 2016, you can see the fire on the bottom left. And the local dwellers say that it was arson. Now, interestingly, this picture is taken before and after. So you see this rearrangement that happened was not due to the fire. This was actually quite far from where the fire happened. But once that fire had happened, and then it sort of like changed the landscape of desire of the settlers in the other parts. It was talked about in the local tea stalls, and they started to say that they need to rearrange. Local NGOs and UNDP and international development NGOs have been trying to widen the road for 10 years, and they have failed to. So rational communicative planning failed miserably. They failed to widen the roads. They failed to negotiate. They failed to do this sort of development in 10 years, because no one wants to give an inch. But once there was this sort of a change in the landscape of the desire through that fire, through and how people responded, this sort of translated into a change that you could see in places far from places that were affected. Which is why I'm interested in how there's this narratives and imaginations, and how they respond on an everyday basis. And all of this complexity, for me, it's difficult to sort of like bring into the package of the bottom up, because I see that there's this differentiations of desire, There's this, the desire of the state to build a world-class global city, the desire of the resident to live for 6 months and go away and not care about the everyday politics, the desire of the water body to flow. So all of this human and non-human's desires sort of intersect in a very complex life that is radically unknowable, but which is why I don't think that what I've done is anything comprehensive, is just my take on it. So yeah, I mean, with that note of not being able to know everything, I'd like to end. Thank you so much. I think I have gone over time, but so sorry for that. Yeah.
Don't be, Tanzil. It was excellent. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you. It's always ugly to finish online because you don't get a real clap, but I'm sure the audience enjoyed it. So I'm stopping the recording now. So thank you again, Tanzil, for your talk. And